Of all the pop cultural touchstones to come out of the 1990s, none was as universally prevalent as The Simpsons. A worldwide smash hit, a cultural phenomena, the cornerstone of the fourth major television network, and an absolute marketing monster, producing everything from books and t-shirts to a wildly dated rap song, and of course, video games. Coming out during the heyday of the Nintendo-Sega wars of the early 1990s, the franchise very quickly saturated the video game market with games across the NES, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Game Gear, and Game Boy. Yet virtually all these games were pretty roundly seen as poor quality and low-effort marketing devices to capitalize on the Simpsons brand for some simple brand loyalty purchases. By the mid to late 90s, the Simpsons marketing boom had waned, and no Simpsons games had been developed for the next generation of consoles, not even the mass-market juggernaut, the PlayStation. For such a dominant cultural property, it seemed like a bit of an odd oversight that it was not jumping on the growing video game market. When Michael Pohl left Electronic Arts and joined Fox Interactive in the year 2000 to become the senior vice president of product development, he found out why the studio had allowed its biggest asset to wither on the vine. In a brilliantly insightful article for the website Input, written by Brian Van Hooker, Pohl detailed a conversation he had with the president of Fox Interactive, Steve Birch. He asked why the company was not using its most valuable piece of intellectual property, and Birch told him simply that Simpsons games don't sell. To which Pohl replied, if you made some good ones, they would. This equally simple statement got Pohl the go-ahead to give his theory a try, and so he was tasked with setting in motion a new Simpsons game. From here he would pass the baton to John Melchior, a producer at Fox Interactive, to begin coordinating this new project. But Fox Interactive was a publisher, not a developer. They needed someone to program a game. They found one in Radical Entertainment. Radical Entertainment was a small development studio located in Vancouver, Canada. Founded in 1991, the studio had kicked around the industry for the rest of the decade, making licensed games, such as Beavis and Butthead and Independence Day, but also some original works, such as Grid Runner and The Divide: Enemies Within. However, in 2000, the company found the rug pulled out from under it when its publishing partner at the time canceled all 4 of the games they had in development. Scrambling to regain its financial balance, the company decided to take the work it had done thus far and craft a tech demo that it could use to win over a new publisher. In fact, they heard that Fox Interactive was looking for someone to make a Simpsons driving game. This was mostly true, although in reality, Fox was not sure exactly what it wanted. The initial idea was to make a game called The Simpsons Racing, but this was quickly dismissed by Matt Groening, since licensed kart racers at the time were a dime a dozen. Plus, he pointed out that in order to get from the Simpsons franchise what it was best known for, its writing, there would need to be at least 2 characters in a car at one time in order to have back and forth dialogue. This was the key thing this new collaboration between Fox Interactive, Gracie Films, and Radical Entertainment was looking to bring to the table that would finally make a Simpsons game worthy of its name. They wanted to make a game that would be faithful to The Simpsons, to its characters, to its world, and to its sense of humor. So, with these suggestions, the demo evolved from the idea of racing into a delivery service. The Simpsons writers would also give the game its name, Simpsons Road Rage, based on this concept, and develop the plot behind the game. Then, Radical Entertainment would be off to the races to turn these ideas into a fully fledged product, with full-blown development starting around the fall of 2000, giving the game a roughly 12-month development cycle. Fortunately, the developers were keen to make sure they nailed the fundamentals before getting too far ahead of themselves in geeking out on Simpsons references. As Joe McGinn at Radical Entertainment would later tell Games Radar, quote, "Before building a single road, we needed to know how the vehicles drive and feel. We had 3 pillars that we talked about incessantly until we drove the team crazy, and then we still talked about them. Fun driving gameplay, exploring an immersive Springfield city, and to never forget we were making a comedy." End quote. While the programmers had their work cut out for them while working out the physics, handling, and control over vehicles, the artists had a whole different challenge, translating the 2-dimensional Simpsons characters into 3D. Here, they had precious little to go off of, since there were so few examples of The Simpsons being recreated in 3 dimensions. They reportedly resorted to using Simpsons toys to model some of the characters in 3D. One example they did have to go off of, though, at least for Homer, was a segment out of the 1995 Treehouse of Horror episode, where Homer crosses over into a highly polished 90s CGI rendered world. Funny enough, this segment was created by the 3D animation studio Pacific Data Images, which had made a name for itself in Hollywood working on special effects, but later went on to create the movies Ants and Shrek for DreamWorks, who would then acquire the company afterwards. A few years after making this 3D Simpsons segment that would be used to inspire a video game, the company would find video games inspiring its own work, as they were contracted by Sega to make the 3D character segments behind their commercials to market the Dreamcast. But with the fundamentals of game design worked out, the modeling and artwork for characters and their world underway, it was really a question of what kind of gameplay this Simpsons driving delivery game would feature. Just saying that sentence, it should be relatively easy to figure out where the inspiration was going to be drawn from. Crazy Taxi. There's no way around the elephant in the room when discussing this game. In the interviews for the input article, the developers are very frank and to the point in saying that everyone involved in the project knew implicitly and explicitly that they were making a clone of Crazy Taxi. But they were also adamant that they were taking a gameplay concept and building on and improving upon it. After all, this is how design of virtually anything works. One person or group comes up with something and releases it into the world to be observed and improved upon. Plus, this game would be taking this solid gameplay loop and wrapping it in a loving blanket of Simpsons fan service, giving it extra character and value for fans of the series. This was all fine and good, but unfortunately for all parties involved in making this game, the concept of building upon an existing idea would run headlong into the legal system. But that was still a problem for the future. There was a more pressing problem that arose during development that had nothing to actually do with this game itself. On April 13th, 2001, the first 3D Simpsons game would be released for the PlayStation. It was not The Simpsons Road Rage. It was a game Fox Interactive had worked with Activision and Big 8 Productions to bring to market called The Simpsons Wrestling. The problem for the Simpsons Road Rage team was not that they were being overshadowed and displaced by a good game, but that they would be dragged down into the abyss by an infamously bad one. The game was seen as shallow in its gameplay, poorly implemented in its graphics and controls, and genuinely off-putting in some of the actual situations where these characters fight each other. It was so poorly received both internally and externally that Matt Groening insisted on having his name removed from the product. It also scored some unheard-of low scores from critics. While some of the earlier Genesis and Super Nintendo Simpsons games had been middling to mediocre, they were still serviceable games capable of distracting a dedicated player for a little while. This one had close to no redeeming features and threatened to make good on the idea that Simpsons games do not sell. Now, while it's not a GameCube game covered by our series, I do try to be fair to the story of every game. During the research for this episode, I came across excellent videos by both Flandreau and Matt McMuscles, going deeper into The Simpsons Wrestling, including interviews with the developers, and explaining why the game came out the way it did, and doing the hard work of pushing back against the overwhelming bandwagon of negative opinion to point out that the game isn't great, but it's also not necessarily 1 out of 10 levels of bad. I'd highly encourage checking out those videos if you're interested. While the Road Rage team was caught off guard by this critical bombshell, they were also relatively unaware of it until it shipped. It wasn't their work, and fortunately they were allowed to continue, albeit with far more scrutiny and approval required from Gracie Films, and Groening in particular. It was a distinct possibility that if The Simpsons Road Rage followed the pattern its predecessors had set in being a critically disastrous cash grab product, it would become the last Simpsons game, as Groening would no longer sign off on any future proposals. It's also no surprise that Fox Interactive would ditch both of its partners from Simpsons Wrestling, as Radical Entertainment was working on this new game. But they also ditched Activision for distribution of the game, instead going with the industry heavyweight Electronic Arts. So it was, with an understandable shade of skepticism, that EA, Fox, and Radical arrived at E3 2001 to unveil its new Simpsons project, in hopes of getting a do-over at taking the series back into video games after the wrestling game disaster. To their relief, gaming reporters that checked out the game said that the game was essentially what the developers had been aiming for all along, a very serviceable Crazy Taxi clone with a pretty genuine Simpsons paint job. They even noted that the render of Homer looked quite a lot like that Treehouse of Horror episode, despite not being privy to the development process. But that particular clip was actually making the rounds as part of a short compilation film of 3D CGI movies called Cyberworld that was being run in select theaters at around that same time. Again, the developers would do their part to point out the ways that they were adding new touches and improving on the Crazy Taxi formula, demonstrating that they would add bonus conditions to every so many runs the character made. There would also be upgradable new cars, as well as a story mode to boot, reminding everyone that this was a console-exclusive game, not an arcade game. As with many things shown at E3 that would later end up on the GameCube, this was the PlayStation 2 version that was being shown, as the PS2 was the lead platform for this game, as with many third-party efforts that year. But it was also on track for both an Xbox and GameCube release shortly after. In fact, Radical Entertainment would tout in a press release a few months later that they had been invited by Nintendo to demonstrate their pure 3D engine on the GameCube to show off its ability to model textures, characters, special effects, and lighting, as well as tout how easily this new technology translated over to Nintendo's new developer-friendly system. And it seemed to be friendly enough, as just a few weeks later, EA would confirm the game as a GameCube launch title. But like with a few other games we've seen so far, after the GameCube was moved back from early to mid-November, this game also got a slight bump and fell just behind the curve, but still in the calendar year, since it reached store shelves just before Christmas by December 19th, 2001. So, diving in, we get the mandatory introductory cutscene. Understandable here since the plot is silly and this is a television show we're talking about. We get our first look at the artist's best shot at rendering The Simpsons, which in the context of the graphical possibilities of the time are pretty good. The only thing that unsettles me is the eyelashes on the female characters. They just seem to stand out in some odd way. But this one line from Marge always manages to get a laugh out of me just because of how absolutely absurdly twisted it is, even for The Simpsons.
That poor man. I hope someone does kill him.
Also, this is yet another Simpsons prediction coming true. As Simpsons writer Matt Selman pointed out in the input article, this pretty aptly mirrors the rise of the Uber/Lyft market. You're dropped from there into a very sparse title screen that looks like clip art against a black background, followed by an equally static menu screen. Clearly, some corners were cut in terms of presentation getting this game to market inside of a year. The settings don't offer up much of interest. You've got 2 control schemes you can choose between, no extra audio or video settings, 3 difficulty choices, the backlog of any clips you unlock during the game, and the credits, which at least feature those fun, Simpsonized versions of the developers and producers that I've been using. Regardless of which driving mode you choose to play, all of them start you with a character select screen, which shows you up front the plethora of Simpsons characters that have been added into this game, although the majority of them are locked away to be earned. Hovering over one of the characters you can select gives you a little in-engine animation of them pulling up and saying a quick quip. But this is hampered by the load time for the engine to kick in, so you would have to intentionally highlight a character and then hold there for a minute or so, otherwise you'd miss this nice little touch. But that load time is nothing compared to the following load time to actually fire up a level, which is noticeable. I'd assume the game is likely loading the whole map into memory, but it's a ding against the game when comparing it to Crazy Taxi, since that game featured shorter and more well-disguised load times, while also rendering what seems like a larger world. Once the game gets going, though, you do see the bet that the team made on this being a Simpsons world, rather than just a facsimile of San Francisco, since you cruise around familiar spots you've seen if you watch the show, and all the characters you pick up are not just nondescript generic archetypes, but characters like Mayor Quimby, Otto, or Principal Skinner, and they usually come equipped with dialogue related to where they're going, and who they're interacting with depending on who the driver is. So this area of preference kinda depends on what you'd rather be delivering customers to. Quips and one-liners from the characters of The Simpsons, or rockin' tunes from The Offspring and Bad Religion, since the very light and generic background music here cannot hold a candle to some of the well-tuned licensed tracks in Crazy Taxi. The important difference Road Rage has up its sleeve is that it was designed explicitly as a home console experience, whereas Crazy Taxi was an arcade game first, with some additions thrown in to extend the value for the home version. The Simpsons Road Rage approached this from the beginning with some of the additions to the formula. While Crazy Taxi is set up to take your quarters and thus shut down your run within 3 minutes, as is the arcade standard, The Simpsons Road Rage feels like you might actually have a chance to keep this going. For one thing, it does away with the intentionally slowed down acceleration out of a parked position. And if you took a look at the controls, you'll notice there's a handbrake button separate from the regular brake that gives you a quick spin on a dime 180 turnaround that's a lot of fun to employ. For a development team that clearly played a lot of Crazy Taxi for inspiration in the making of this game, it would seem that they decided to edit out certain annoyances from the player's perspective that stemmed from the arcade model of gameplay. Of course, as the developers pointed out, there's also progression that makes up a roughly defined single-player mode, as your driving sessions earn you money that accumulate and let you purchase new areas to drive as well as more drivers and cars. There's an ultimate endpoint where if you earn enough money, you'll eventually thwart Mr. Burns' plans for radioactive public transportation, which technically gives the game an end. There's also a few additional modes that differ a bit from Sega's original work. There's the Sunday Drive, which plops you down in any of the maps you've unlocked and lets you just play the game with no time limits at all to practice and get to know the maps. Without a time limit, this mode can last forever, which is a bit longer than the longest 10-minute mode you can choose in Crazy Taxi. But realistically, are you going to drive the map for half of an hour? Instead of crazy box challenges, Road Rage has 10 missions you can engage in, almost all of which are knock over a certain number of items in the level type challenges, and 1 or 2 are deliver a person in time challenges, all of which are less than 60 seconds long. So with 10 missions, there's not a whole lot of content here either, but they are achievable just by playing the game, rather than mastering the tiny intricacies like in Crazy Taxi's box challenges. The little additions to the formula within the game itself are also welcome additions. Every so many customers, you'll get an additional challenge for completing the run, such as taking out as many objects as you can on the way, or avoiding hitting other cars, which will net you additional money if you can pull it off. Plus, there are some occasional adversaries on the map as well, since the radioactive buses you're competing with will lock onto you once you come into their field and just straight up ram you and try to obstruct your path. One thing this game does unquestionably have over Crazy Taxi is a split-screen multiplayer mode, which sets you up to play a little game of possession with the customers as you can snatch the fare from each other by hitting your opponent's car. It's a solid implementation of multiplayer for this genre. So why all the Crazy Taxi comparisons? Besides the fact it's quite apparent where the inspiration came from, this became a very real legal issue, as Sega of America would later bring suit against Fox Interactive for infringing on the patents Sega held on the gameplay concept behind Crazy Taxi, like the directional arrow system for navigation. This charge ended up being quietly settled out of court by both parties, with Michael Pohl describing the conclusion as saying, quote, "At the end of the day, there was a number that was paid to Sega that was insignificant to the money that was generated by the game, and everyone moved on. Sega came for their pound of flesh, but I think they walked away with a £quarter instead." End quote. That significant amount of money Fox felt comfortable paying Sega with came from the fact that The Simpsons Road Rage was a tremendous success for everyone involved, well, except maybe Sega. According to VG Charts, the game would go on to sell 3.61 million units worldwide just for the PS2. In addition, it sold 1.05 million on the Xbox, and an additional 240,000 units on the GameCube. These numbers give us two interesting insights. First, it shows what a big disparity between sales on the different platforms publishers were looking at when putting their games onto the GameCube. Considering the Xbox and the GameCube were close to even in hardware sales, the fact that a game would sell 4 times as well on the Xbox versus the GameCube was a big red flag for third parties. The other interesting thing comes into view if you look at Crazy Taxi's own worldwide sales. The first Crazy Taxi game sold 1.81 million copies on the Dreamcast, 2.52 million on the PS2, and 490,000 on the GameCube. While this once again demonstrates the problem third parties would have selling their games on Nintendo's system, putting that aside, if you did the math on those numbers, that also means that The Simpsons Road Rage sold 4.9 million copies worldwide, while Crazy Taxi sold 4.82 million. So Radical Entertainment, Fox Interactive, and Electronic Arts quite literally beat Sega at their own game. But that wasn't all. As the overview of this game suggests, it's just as light on content as Crazy Taxi is. There's no deep story mode that'll keep you playing for hours and hours to reach a satisfying conclusion. It's a pick-up-and-play game meant for quick shots of gaming, something uniquely suited to the rental market. Something the publisher was happy to tout as it issued a press release in December of 2001, hailing the fact that their new Simpsons game was in the top 10 rental charts for the PS2. No mean feat considering the amount of games in that system even just 1 year in. And so the bet had paid off, with some actual effort to make or copy a good game depending on how you look at it, paired with some genuine care to collaborate with the show's creators in order to give it a real sense of belonging in the Simpsons universe. Fox now had its answer. Simpsons games could sell. The question is, what to do next with that? We'll keep our eyes open. We haven't heard the end of this particular story.
Anyway, I'm a mess if you can't tell.